5. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Christian Bernhard from the State University of New York at Fredonia. You can see the title of his talk in front of you, so I shan't embarrass myself by reading it. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. So looking at happiness and gratitude, I know the term happiness is a bit loaded, and we've been discussing that at various points today, and I'll try to better define that as we go. I became interested in this topic to begin with because for the past 10 or 15 years, I've been looking a lot at stress and burnout among music teachers. So I thought, instead of looking at the negative or the pathology, maybe looking at a more positive version of that. So really this idea has been researched, Christina Maslow's burnout inventory since the 1960s, 1970s. And her idea, along with her various colleagues, was that anyone in the helping profession is susceptible to stress and burnout. When human beings are helping other humans, whether it be a pastor or a doctor, a therapist, or of course a teacher, that we are susceptible to wearing ourselves out. The main three variables they look at are emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and the lack of personal accomplishment. Usually emotional exhaustion is a first sign of burnout, something that a lot of us experience maybe on a daily basis, especially around the time of the pandemic. But sometimes it's only once a week or so, but it can lead into further problems such as depersonalization, when we start to blame other people for our problems, or essentially having an external locus of control. If only something else would improve, if only the weather would get better, I will be in a better place. And of course, that's leading to signs of burnout. And finally, the lack of personal accomplishment, that even if the rest of the world sees us as being successful, or maybe the students seem fine with what's happening, if the teacher is feeling this lack of personal accomplishment, it again can lead down a bad road. The idea of distress is something that we want to avoid, but the notion of eustress is actually a positive thing. I did early on a couple of sessions about essentially overcoming stress as a music teacher. Stress is never going to go away. Stress is always going to be here, but it's an idea of how we work with stress, and the stress can actually be a good thing. So the idea of eustress is that a deadline or upcoming concert or something of that sort can actually be a very good and motivating thing for us and for our students. So the idea of eustress leads into the field of positive psychology. Again, we were hearing a bit about this earlier in the morning. The ideas of variables like gratitude, a feeling of thanksgiving, and then the PERMA model that was mentioned earlier. So pleasure or positive emotion, this would be a hedonistic feeling of pleasure. And I think Roger was talking a bit about this as well as June. That's not all that there is to happiness. And in fact, early on, Martin Seligman said maybe pleasure's 10, 20% of it, but that it's much more important to have things like deep meaning, lifelong purpose, and then the idea of engagement, like a psychological flow of Csikszentmihalyi, that we're able to be in a moment for 20, 25, 30 minutes and not really even notice the clock passing. Later, Martin Seligman wrote about the importance of human relationships and again of personal accomplishments. And of course, personal accomplishments links in well with the burnout research that Maslow had done earlier. The first four variables are what I measured in the study that I did. So gratitude, pleasure, meaning, and engagement. And the primary purpose was to look at these four variables among music teachers by grade level taught. And it was either elementary school teachers, middle or high school, the certification status, either beginning teachers or more experienced teachers, and teaching area. That would be either instrumental, choral general, or a combination of those areas. And as I did with my previous burnout research, I wanted to look at some secondary variables. So looking at not only the happiness and gratitude, but personal variables, teaching variables like how many hours per week do you teach? How many hours per week do you spend preparing for teaching? How many hours per week do you sleep or exercise or spend with your family? So looking at the gratitude, well, first of all, gratitude was measured using this GQ6. McCullough, Emmons, and Sang in 2002 published this questionnaire. Let's see if I can get it to pull up here. And Gareth, you're actually seeing it this time, the table? Yes, okay, good. When Gareth and I did our test earlier in the week, we weren't seeing the tables pop up. So it is a 6-item survey here on a 7-point scale. So for example, item number 1, I have so much in life to be thankful for. We would want this, of course, to be a 6 or a 7. Items number 3 and 6 are reverse scored. So for example, item number 3, when I look at the world, I don't see much to be grateful for. We would hope that maybe a score will be 1 or 2 or something of that sort. And then at the bottom, the scoring instructions look more complicated than perhaps they are. Really, the idea is that it's additive, and the final number should be somewhere between 6 and 42. So a strong level of gratitude would be 42, all the way down to a possible score of 6. Happiness, the meaning, pleasure, engagement was all measured by this orientation to happiness. Peterson, Park, and Seligman. Chris Peterson actually passed away a few years ago, so I reached out to Namsuk Park. She's at University of Michigan in their Department of Positive Psychology. The field has really blossomed a lot in the last couple of decades, to the point that a place like Michigan or Pennsylvania have actual departments of positive psychology. And she was happy to share this measure, to have us use it for the survey or for the research. The orientation to happiness measures all 3 of these variables down here. 6 items per variable. And you see at the end of each statement which variable is being measured. So for example, item number 1 measures engagement, item number 2 meaning, item number 3 pleasure, etc. 5-point scale. And the scoring is done such that you add up, it's additive again, you add up all the scores. So for example, with engagement, you could have a total of 30 points if you scored 5 points for all 6 items. And then you take those 30 points, divide by 6, and you end up with a score for meaning, a separate score for engagement, a separate score for pleasure, all on a scale of 1 to 5. And then there was a demographic data form that measured all of the other variables of interest. Don Hamann created the original version back in 1986. When I did my stress and burnout research, I asked Dr. Hamann for permission, and he said, well, yes, but the form blew up on a computer sometime in the 1980s. So you're welcome to use what's published. And so I took that and adapted it slightly. But what you're seeing right now is the same form that I used for my burnout research over the past decade or so. So just general information, grade level taught, etc. Average, and then we get into other variables like the average number of hours per teaching, all the way down to things like exercise, sleep, even relaxing, socializing. And again, it's all self-report. The participants were all from the state of New York. Those of you who are familiar with this area, NYSSMA, or the New York State School Music Association. I took that directory, sent out an email through Google Form with these 3 surveys, and I sent it out to 500 potential participants and ended up with close to half of those responses. So 235 total participants. Collectively, the mean scores for pleasure and gratitude were comparable to adults in previous studies. This is a bit of comparing apples to oranges. It wasn't really the primary purpose of what I was trying to do, but I think as a beginning point, just eyeballing the data and looking to how it compares to some previous studies of other adults. Pleasure and gratitude for these music teachers was fairly similar. The mean scores for engagement compared to other studies were a bit lower, and I'll talk about why the engagement scores might have been a little lower. They were a little higher for meaning. So maybe something about the music teaching profession. We've heard a little bit about this earlier in the day, but just this calling to being in the profession that perhaps results in these music teachers scoring a little higher on meaning. By grade level taught, I'll give you a moment to acclimate yourself to this. Across the top, you have scores, the averages for meaning, for pleasure, for engagement, and for gratitude. And again, meaning, pleasure, and engagement were on a 5-point scale. So anywhere from 1 to 5 for the averages. And the gratitude was on a scale anywhere from 6 to 42. The colors that I've highlighted are showing the statistical significance. So elementary school teachers reported significantly higher meaning. The red is higher and the blue is lower. Higher meaning than the others. High school teachers reported significantly higher engagement than the other teachers. And middle school teachers reported significantly lower levels of gratitude than the other teachers. It's interesting that combination, folks who taught a little bit of elementary, middle, or high school, or some kind of combination, there were not significant differences there. The burnout research that I did previously showed that those who taught a combination of grade levels or a combination of areas tended to have more stress or more burnout as measured by the Maslow burnout inventory, but that was not found here. By certification status, not too surprising. The initial and professional means it's the type of certification that we have in the state of New York. So teachers in their first 3 or 4 years have this initial certification. And then once they have the 3 or 4 years experience plus a master's degree, they get a professional level certification. And as you can see, those who are beginning teachers reported significantly lower meaning, significantly lower gratitude than their peers who had been teaching a little longer. And this is very similar to the burnout research, and it supports findings from other studies that we definitely need to support beginning teachers. We know anecdotally, and we also know from research that if teachers are going to leave, it's often going to be during the first 5 years of their career. By teaching area, instrumental music teachers reported significantly higher levels of gratitude than the others. Again, no differences with combination. I don't know exactly why, but the choral general folks, at least in this study, there were only 70 of them. So there were 130 instrumental teachers, 70 reported choral general. And the other thing is I did not separate choral or general. I lumped them together because a lot of teachers in the state of New York end up, if they are teaching voice, they're tending to teach some general music as well. But I did lump them together, and they reported significantly lower levels of meaning and engagement than the other teachers. And finally, looking at these secondary variables, first of all, you have the averages, the means and the standard deviations for hours per week of teaching, preparing, exercise, sleep. So for example, for sleep per week, 45 hours, that comes out to about 6.5 hours per night, which is a little less than the recommended 7 to 9 hours. You also see the standard deviation is about 8 there. So there are some teachers who are reporting as few as, say, 37 hours of sleep per week, a little on the low end. And then the correlation coefficients, these are the ones that were statistically significant. And again, they're not all overly strong coefficients, and we're not talking about causation here, but it is a point of interest to say it makes sense that someone who scored high on meaning would also score high on gratitude, and same with engagement. The relationship between hours of teaching and meaning, I think, is very interesting. We know anecdotally that a lot of teachers say, well, I don't enjoy the lesson planning, I don't enjoy some of the administrative tasks of my job, but when I actually get to interact with the students, that brings me a lot of meaning, or even joy was the word that was used earlier today. And you can see lower there, gratitude and hours of preparation are actually negatively correlated. So perhaps something about the advanced work or the paperwork that people don't enjoy, but actually interacting with students can be very positive. The one other variable here, hours of exercise, and again, they're fairly weak correlations. They're not all that strong, but they are positive between hours of exercise and both gratitude and engagement. So participants who tended to report more hours of exercise per week also tended to be the ones who were reporting higher levels of gratitude and engagement. And finally, at the very end, you see their hours of teaching, hours of sleep are negatively correlated. Those who are teaching more, perhaps sleeping less. So a bit of discussion. Collectively, actually, this group was fairly healthy. I collected these data a year ago in spring of 2019. So I suspect that it would look a little different now during a pandemic when these teachers have been thrown into online teaching unexpectedly. We hear from teachers who are saying that my students are not responding, or a lot of my students don't have access to the technology they need to participate. There's a lot more stress involved right now. But in 2019, this group who participated was doing pretty well. I also did a survey the year before in spring of 2018 with undergraduates, with pre-service teachers. And the pre-service teachers also were actually not in as good a shape, which again might not surprise you. So the college students actually a little less, but these folks, not too bad. Pleasure and gratitude were comparable, as I said, to other studies. The meaning was a bit above average, something about music teaching that could be fulfilling lifelong purpose. And the engagement, I think, it was also low for the college students. I think something about the way engagement is measured by the orientation to happiness. You know, there's a lot of warning about digital distraction. And I think it's even before the pandemic, even before we were doing things like Zoom and getting all kinds of extra news feeds, just the proliferation of social media and the number of news feeds we're seeing and the amount of screen time that we spend, it can be very problematic, and to the point that we're having trouble as a society of really engaging deeply with texts and more complex ideas. Certainly we need further research. I would like to do a little bit more qualitative data, collect more qualitative ideas. My wife makes fun of me for collecting too many stats, for being too quantitative. So I think a next step could be getting more information about what these teachers are thinking. As I said before, we need support for new teachers. This is going to be especially important for the folks who are coming into the profession now. We have a group of student teachers who just graduated, and essentially they lost out on 7 weeks of their student teaching because everything went online. Some of them were able to help their teachers, but they all missed out on 7 weeks of in-person teaching. And in fact, in the state of New York, I believe it's going to be mandatory that these folks, as they get hired, are going to have extra mentoring that's required. So you could think of that negatively, but also positively, that it's a chance for support for these new teachers. Possibly support for middle school, at least in these data. We know anecdotally maybe middle school could be a little bit more of a challenging age. And support maybe for choral general. Again, we could use other data sets, but at least here that's what we found. And the importance of sleep and exercise in this correlation analyses. There's quite a bit of data on that, and anecdotally we know they're important. And it leads finally to this last slide. This is a project that I've been working on based out of some of these research studies. It's a book that's just now going into production with Routledge. It should be out within the next couple months, I think. But what I did was wrote a chapter about each of these variables. First, the idea that eustress is good. Really, with the whole book, I was trying to take the perspective that there are lots of music teachers who flourish. There are lots of music teachers who love their jobs and who want to do this. And so again, instead of focusing on pathology, thinking about what makes the profession good and why certain teachers do so very well. Addressing the traditional trio there of sleep, physical movement, and nutrition, getting those in good order, and then the newer ideas from positive psychology of practicing gratitude, the 3 components here of happiness, and of course now with the PERMA model, we could even call that 5-point variables of leading into happiness. And then this idea of mindfulness that has been getting a lot of attention recently. A lot of K-12 teachers are using this with their students. There's quite a bit now on teaching mindfulness to elementary and secondary students, and of course the importance of it for teachers as well. We heard a bit about mindfulness from Heather and Aaron earlier today, and I know there's another presentation about it tomorrow, so I think I will leave it at that. My email address is here. Feel free to reach out. And I think at this point, I'll open our virtual floor for discussion.